Welcome to Regulatory Ramblings. Our podcast today is brought to you by the University of Hong Kong's RegTech Lab, the HKU SCF FinTech Academy, the Asia Global Institute, and the HKU edX Professional Certificate in FinTech, with support from the university's Faculty of Law. I'm your host, Ajay Shandasani. The theme of today's episode is the recent decision by U.S. President Donald Trump's administration to scale back enforcement of anti-money laundering via the Corporate Transparency Act with regard to beneficial ownership. The administration's claim is that the burden of the act is too onerous from a compliance perspective for small and medium firms. In our initial Spotlight segment, we'll be speaking with renowned counter-money laundering specialist Nigel Morris-Cottrell on the implications of the Trump administration's move for Asia. Following that, we'll chat with former U.S. Naval Intelligence Officer Malcolm Nance and compliance maven Una Vandenberg, founder of Raw Compliance Consultancy, on the recent action by Washington and what it means for policy for the globe writ large. But first, the U.S. Treasury announced in early March that it would stop enforcing, quote, any penalties or fines associated with the beneficial ownership information reporting rule under the existing regulatory deadlines, but it will further not enforce any penalties or fines against U.S. citizens or domestic reporting companies or their beneficial owners after the forthcoming rule changes take effect either, end quote. The net result, the U.S. government will no longer require shell companies to disclose their owners and beneficiaries, allowing wealthy corporations and individuals to hide their profits from the public. The rule was part of the 2021 Corporate Transparency Act, which required some businesses to report information on people who own or control companies, indirectly or directly, to the Treasury Department's FinCEN, or Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. Indeed, President Trump took to Truth Social after the Treasury's announcement to post, almost gloatingly, quote, the Biden rule has been an absolute disaster for small businesses nationwide. Trump's post read, furthermore, the Treasury is now finalizing an emergency regulation to formally suspend this rule for American businesses. The economic menace of beneficial ownership information reporting will soon be no more, end quote. Now, Republicans had long opposed the CTA, claiming its requirements were too onerous for small and medium businesses. The rule on beneficial ownership was supposed to go into effect in January, but a federal court order froze enforcement of the rule. The CTA was passed by the Biden administration to tackle tax evasion and corporate cronyism, which the Trump administration clearly views differently. Following his second inauguration on January 20th, Trump has gone after financial regulation as well as governmental agencies seeking to curb corporate and banking power, such as the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. And earlier in March, the president also issued an executive order halting enforcement of the 48-year-old Foreign Corrupt Practices Act for at least a year pending revised guidelines. The FCPA prohibits any person or company tied to the U.S. from paying money or offering gifts to foreign officials. With us to discuss the matter is Nigel Morris-Cottrell, a returning guest to the show and one of our most popular experts. Nigel was a solicitor in London, dealing with, over the course of his career, a wide range of matters, including contracts, property, company law, litigation, international trade, criminal law, IP, family law, and financial services complaints. In 1994, he brought all of those areas to bear on what was then a new field, financial crime risk and compliance. As a strategist, he identifies trends long before they become fashionable and talked about. Nigel is the author of How Not to Be a Money Launderer, and as of April of 2025, will publish the second volume of Trade-Based Financial Crime, Beyond TBML. Wow, what a storied career! What achievements, Nigel! Thank you so much for joining us.
I sound quite impressive, don't I?
You are. I mean, if the shoe fits, right? I mean, yeah.
Okay, so looking at what you've been talking about, the first thing is that there is a very clear divide in the way that people are viewing this. The broad left are absolutely up in arms. So let's take out the politics, because the broad left will be up in arms about anything Trump says, and the broad right are in favor of everything Trump says without question. So we can discount a huge amount of what is in the media, and the only place to find out what is really going on is to go and look at FinCEN. And FinCEN said that it was releasing a draft final rule called Beneficial Ownership Information Reporting Requirement Revision and Deadline Extension. And that draft final rule came into force on the 26th of March, which was the next day after the draft final rule was published. There is a comment period that ends on the 27th of March. And so this is a draft final rule, but we can be reasonably sure that, given the pressure that is being brought to bear from the White House, that this is going to be what we see. So importantly, what does it do? Well, someone has got the idea that this is not a termination, that it is a 180-day suspension. I have to say I've not found that in the official material, but that is reported somewhere in the press. I think that what we need to bear in mind is that this was not a good system to start with. It was full of holes, the implementation was appalling, and it required an enormous amount of effort, particularly on the part of foreign businesses, to complete forms which were designed for domestic businesses. And so the next question is, what information was it in fact collecting? Well, truthfully, not very much that was new. I mean, I know that there have been people who say that it was getting information that was not readily available, but the information has been available, or the important information has been available through the IRS. And the IRS is part of Treasury, as is FinCEN. And so what we saw here was a failure to match up the two departments for the information that is already available. So there was an enormous amount of work that had to be done by particularly US businesses or US companies. Let's be clear about this. These are not firms. That means partnerships. These are not businesses in the generic sense. These are specifically companies. And companies which are registered in the US, interestingly, are not registered in the US as a federal registration. They are registered in individual states. So it's possible to have John Smith Limited, John Smith Inc., or whatever, in multiple states, the same name, but multiple states, all registered in the US. There is no central US database of companies outside the tax authority. So what this was an effort to do was to centralize information, but instead of requiring the states to submit it, because that would have been politically difficult because the states don't like giving information to federal authorities, what happened was that the federal authorities went straight to the individual companies and their owners and said, we want to know who owns you and where that level of ownership ends. So the term beneficial ownership is not technically correct. It's a term that arrived in the US Senate hearing in the 1980s. At least that's the first time I've come across it. But beneficial ownership is a term used in trusts. It's not really a corporate law issue, because the beneficiary of a trust does not have the legal right over that trust. It has the right to share in the benefits of it. So to call it beneficial ownership is in some areas of law quite confusing. So having said all of that, what did it do? It simply said, any company which operates in the US, be it domestically incorporated or incorporated overseas, must deliver to FinCEN via an online form all the information relating to its shareholders, and where those shareholders are not named on the documents, any hidden shareholders. So in that way, you might say it was kind of related to trusts, but not really. So this was basically a very, very simple process. We want to know who owns companies, and we want to know how many levels deep that ownership goes. And the reason that the USA was doing this was because it's been imposed, effectively, by the Financial Action Task Force. Now, the USA has a very simple attitude to the Financial Action Task Force. It tells the Financial Action Task Force what the USA wants and expects that to be done. But if the USA doesn't want to do what the Financial Action Task Force says, having listened to other companies, the USA simply doesn't do it. And the USA is incredibly non-compliant with the FATF's 40 recommendations and some recommendations. And when you look at a table of how much the USA does, it fails quite extensively. So the big question we're going to see here is, having now basically said to the FATF, we don't care about this beneficial ownership requirement, despite the fact we were the ones who started it. What are you going to do about it? And the FATF, because the FATF is effectively a lackey of the USA in many respects, will say nothing, just as it did in the late 1990s over the USA's refusal to implement suspicious activity reporting and effective Know Your Customer. So the USA will just say no, and it has a history of doing so. What effect will it have on ordinary businesses? Well, domestic businesses will be relieved of a very substantial amount of administrative work, some of which is quite complex. It will be relieved of having to do that work on a regular basis as information is updated, because every time there is a change of shareholding, that information must be updated within 30 days. So it's an awful lot of work to be done. For foreign businesses, then it says, okay, you have to register if you're doing business in the US. And that kind of ties in with a lot of the corruption work, the anti-corruption work, and the sanctions that are imposed through OFAC, because they want the information about who's behind companies which may be breaching OFAC regulations and the like, or OFAC sanctions and the like. So there is logic from the USA perspective in keeping that information, and there is also logic in saying that it is a matter of national security. So what are the big downsides of it? Well, if a foreign national creates a company in the USA, there is now not going to be any requirement upon that foreign national to report under these regulations. Because what they failed to do is to say foreign owners of companies must register. Now, that's basically what you have to do if a foreigner buys a property in the UK. They must now register as the property being in foreign ownership. But there is still no specific requirement for foreign ownership of corporations, pretty much anywhere in the world, so far as I can see. So what do we actually have? We have a simple loophole, which is turn up in a low reporting jurisdiction like Delaware, Dakota, or somewhere like that, where the information which is kept by the state is very, very limited. Create a company, use that company for pretty much any purposes you like, and not have to make a report. So what would be said is, that's okay because we have eyes on the money. Well, that's exactly the phrase that was used by Stephen something of FinCEN, relating to why it would not be necessary to put in place the requirements in the USA Patriot Act that there were that quote hedge funds. I don't like the term hedge funds because they're not hedge funds, but alternative investment vehicles masquerading as hedge funds. Those vehicles were, according to the USA Patriot Act, supposed to be subject within 6 months to know your customer requirements. That faffed on for years, and in fact is now back before Congress again, and I'm told that there is a reasonable chance it will get passed this time. But there was a draft final rule, and FinCEN withdrew it, saying expressly, we don't need it because we have eyes on the money through the banks. Well, 3 days later, well, 3 weeks later, roughly, that's when the Madoff scandal exploded, proving that the banks may have eyes on the money, but they don't do anything about it, or not enough about it.
When it comes to our region, though, what should we know or fear or be prepared for? I mean, what does it mean for lawyers and compliance professionals in our region, particularly those that serve the financial sector, or is this just a matter of can they breathe more easily now?
They are no worse off in terms of KYC on American corporations than they were 6 months ago. So, or a few months ago, before this was implemented. I don't remember the exact date it was implemented now. So
the impact on APAC won't be that great.
Well, there's two aspects to it. The first is, say a Hong Kong bank takes on a customer which is an American business, American registered corporation. It will not be in any worse position than it was before the requirements were put in place. However, it will be in a worse position vis-a-vis Hong Kong regulation, because Hong Kong regulation requires that there be the full range of ownership, right the way back to the ultimate owners, the ultimate shareholders, be they registered or not. So a bank or a law firm or anybody who is required to undertake these measures, dealing with a US registered company, will now find itself in a conflict between the American stuff, which says you don't need to do this, and the Hong Kong stuff that says you need to get this information. And what it means is that the Hong Kong businesses will not have a government-regulated database to go and check, but access to that database was going to be very restricted anyway, which is one of the reasons that I said it wasn't a good system. So then again, not really losing very much by this process. In relation to those advising Hong Kong businesses, for example, anyone in the region, setting up a business in the USA, they still have to comply with it. And they really should get a US advisor to help them with the forms and make sure they are in compliance. And they have to, and as I said, they have to remain in compliance. The timetables for doing things once for businesses that are registered is quite tight, and the penalties can be very substantial. And one of the interesting things about what is proposed here is the penalties for foreign businesses that do not keep up to date with their filings will be increased, and they're already quite substantial.
So if we take a step back and we look at it from the macro level, what does this mean in terms of the global fight against money laundering? And can we expect instances of perhaps selective enforcement by the Americans?
But they always do.
Because it's political too.
If we look at a slightly different topic, if we look at sanctions, you'll see that Myanmar, which the USA insists on calling Burma, has been subject to sanctions for a very long time, even long after it was removed by the Financial Action Task Force. And what the US government did was say very simply, we will not, the US sanctions will remain in place, but we will not enforce them against US companies. And so foreign companies doing business in US dollars in Myanmar were still subject to US sanctions. So we can assume that the US is going to be selective in whatever it chooses to do here. Is it going to choose those countries that it doesn't like? Yeah, of course it will. And we know that politically, Trump has he has basically a hit list of countries he wants to attack. And he's going after them in every possible way. So yes, there will be very selective enforcement against this, as we've seen in relation to some of the sanctions that are being imposed and some of the prosecutions that are being imposed. There is already a significant uptick in prosecutions against Chinese nationals within the USA for all kinds of things. They're tending to cluster them under national security, as they are doing with this. They're saying that this is a national security issue, and to an extent it's true. So anything where he can find a national security tag to say, I want to attack nationals of that country, either within the US or overseas, that is exactly what Trump is going to do.
In the time we've got left, any closing thoughts, any chestnuts of wisdom you'd like to impart our listeners with?
There is something which Trump has not done, but is under pressure to do, which is to change the cash transaction reporting limits, which have been in place since the 1980s of $10,000 US. Banks and others are pressing for that to be revised. And indeed in 1999, I interviewed Jim Sloan, the then director of FinCEN, and put this $10,000 limit to him and said, this is really such a tiny amount of money don't you think that it would be a good idea if it was increased? And he said no, because it is a tiny amount of money, but the question is not the amount of money, it's what happens with that money. So it seems to me that the limit should be increased, but should it go up to $75,000 or $100,000? No, I think that's too much. I think that if we were to look at $25,000, that would not be unreasonable. This would also have a significant benefit to law enforcement, which would not then be looking for $10,001 everywhere. It would also reduce the amount of noise within FinCEN and the amount of data that FinCEN has to process. Remember that if you double the amount of data, you quadruple the amount of computing power. Now, 20 years ago, FinCEN's computers couldn't cope, and they were basically subletting computing power off the Treasury. Where are we now? The computing power required, I know computing power has gone down, and there's technology that makes it much easier and much cheaper to use. But the amount of data which FinCEN has to deal with is enormous. And I think that reducing the cash transaction reporting burden would go a very long way towards improving the quality of the information that FinCEN is able to process through suspicious activity reports.
Nigel Morris-Cotterill, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you very much, AJ.
We're continuing our discussion of the Trump administration's decision to scale back its anti-money laundering enforcement. Our next two guests are both Regulatory Ramblings alumni. Malcolm Nance joins us from upstate New York. He was a 20-year veteran of the U.S. Navy, where he was an intelligence officer specializing in counterterrorism, intelligence, and violent extremism as an advisor for the U.S. government's law enforcement, Homeland Security, and intelligence agencies. He's best known for his appearances on MSNBC, where he warned about Russian interference in the run-up to the 2016 and 2020 U.S. presidential elections. Malcolm is also a best-selling author with his books The Plot to Hack America, The Plot to Destroy Democracy, and The Plot to Betray America. And most recently, They Want to Kill Americans. You can discover more from Malcolm at his Substack and his podcast, Black Man Spy, on YouTube. Una Vandenberg is the founder of the compliance consultancy and training firm Raw Compliance. She's a compliance industry veteran, having been based in Asian financial hubs such as Singapore and Hong Kong. She's currently based in Portugal. And with that, Una, Malcolm, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us.
Always a pleasure to be here.
Not long after the Treasury made its announcement that Trump took to Truth Social, lambasting the law, saying it was a bad move by the Biden administration. I mean, typically there's continuity when it comes to the important things. AML, I think, post 9/11, multiple presidents have realized that it's important in the global fight against terror and organized crime. It just seems counterintuitive then to just dismiss it like that.
I think it's important to put things in context, especially as we enter into this discussion, because there's a number of issues to really deep dive into. When this was announced on the 10th of February, they did give themselves a 180-day timeline within which this temporary pause in enforcement action would be put in place. And primarily, that was to give the Trump administration the opportunity to consider, the administration of foreign policy, but also as well to review, the FCPA, the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act's enforcement guidelines. And that's not to say this may or may not be extended and that there may be changes in terms of what that enforcement would look like going forward. But this wasn't a carte blanche, we're getting rid of, corruption enforcement. This was rather, we need an opportunity to review, because in the views of the administration, some of the requirements that had been implemented were actually hindering the competitive advantage of US businesses. Don't get me wrong, as an AML financial crime practitioner, there's a lot of stuff to unpack in this, but I think it's important to start with the real facts that we're yet to see what this will look like after the 180-day period.
I'm going to look at it from the perspective of the people who would want to be hiding their monies and their profits, the individual owners, beneficiaries, from legitimate governments, legitimate banking regulators, and AML practitioners, which is, the enforcement arms also were tracking down illicit money. So I come from the dark world, the spy world, and there is an enormous, almost Niagara Falls-like level flow of illegal monies around the world. The profits are in the hundreds of billions of dollars, and the only thing hindering that money from coming quickly into the markets are the fact that there are regulations and there are laws within the global infrastructure which help us limit dirty money coming in and becoming legitimate money. Now, unlike most other American presidents, Donald Trump has historically been against, these regulatory practices which hinder the free flow of money, including money which may or may not be dirty, money which may be sanctioned, monies which could be fueling terrorism or can have a secondary or tertiary effect of fueling terrorism. I think one of the problems that we have now in the second term of the Trump administration is he just loves money, and he just does not care now where it comes from. And many businesses have complained. We've spoken about it on this podcast in the past. Many businesses have complained that they lose a competitive advantage in places where bribes, where having to know precisely where the dollars that are flowing into their bank coffers are coming from. And certainly in a time where we have global economic sanctions against, the Russian oligarchy and the Russian state, there are people out there who believe that's trillions of dollars that could be coming into their businesses or coming into their nations. And unfortunately, the president of the United States is one of those people. So by suspending this, by putting it in abeyance and allowing this regulatory period where, a regulatory suspension period where they're going to quote unquote review it, they celebrated the, the suspension of this on the very day that it was enacted. So, money laundering to a person like Donald Trump, right? He comes from the real estate world. He knew that enormous amounts of Russian money were coming into his businesses. He just doesn't care. And when he hears from other businesses coming and saying, hey, we're not getting maximum dollars here because of these regulations, he views anything like that as onerous. In his philosophy, I suspect, is quite easily summarized as go get your money.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And at the same time where we saw, the step away from kind of the FCPA, we also saw announcement that in fact 2 units that had been set up specifically to focus on fighting, kleptocracy were actually being disbanded, and rather their focus, and what their focus had been previously was very much on looking at sanction regimes and Russian oligarchs and circumvention of those regimes, rather to refocus on drug cartels and transnational crime. But one of the things I'm quite conscious about as well at the moment is obviously the US will be going under a major overhaul of the sanctions regimes, especially in light of the Ukraine and Russian negotiations. But on the other side as well, one of the things I'm very, very, very conscious about is the fact that if we look in particular at transnational crime, it does need a major focus at the moment, because those are the crimes that are really impacting your day-to-day person on the street at the moment. And I'm seeing and I'm dealing with individuals, on a weekly basis through some work that I do with Funds Rehab, where we're helping just general members of the public to try and identify how they can reclaim monies they've lost through investment scams, romance scams, money mule activity. And this is a major issue for the general public at large. So one of the things that when I saw this coming out, I fully understand the fact that drug cartels and kind of, kleptocracy aren't mutually exclusive. There is a big overlap there in terms of activities and kind of methods of money laundering. But transnational crime, not a lot of the financial crimes that we're seeing now in the typologies, they're no longer onshore. They're a blend of, cyber crimes, fraud, money laundering schemes that are being orchestrated from places such as Southeast Asia. So I do generally believe that there needs to be a significant focus on these for the public at large, where billions of dollars are being lost. But I definitely do agree with what you're saying, that it could be a very short-sighted focus as well, because of the fact that there is a hell of a lot of corruption that's happening within kind of kleptocracy regimes as well.
Yeah, there was a lot of kickback against Trump in 2017 when he took aim at just suggesting that he would suspend the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the FCPA. And now he's done that. He has suspended the FCPA in the United States. We spoke about this, I think, or spoke about this a couple of months ago. It's gone. And he views it as any regulation which hinders the ability of American corporations to maximize those dollars is a bad regulation. And, he understands as from his real estate days. And I know people that know him very, very personally. Michael Cohen, who was his consigliere, right, his lawyer for many, many years, confirms that he worked with people who dealt in corruption, kickback bribes were part of the game, and he views that as some amusing, I can put it, an amuse-bouche before the main course of a meal of corporate payoff. And I think he has incorporated that into his mindset that in regulating the United States government, he's just going to disable that and allow people to take profit with completely few or none restrictions. And he doesn't care whether they are hiding them from the public. It is, as you said, when you're dealing with kleptocracies, it's really about the money, not the theft in his world. Also, I think that a lot of these mid-level organizations who see this money flowing in from cyber crimes, who see it coming in from scams, whether it's Nigeria or Jamaica or Colombia, wherever, they are more interested in the giant stacks of money. So when I come at it from the counterterrorism or the intelligence perspective, that we are trying to interdict money flows from the United States out to third parties who are going to launder that money so it doesn't go back to Colombia and or wherever, Ecuador, and then it gets turned around into huge shipments of submarine launched drugs back to the United States. You have to have a respect that the money fuels the bad world. And if you don't have an interdiction capability, bad things get worse. Fentanyl trafficking into the United States is at an all-time high. There were 21,000 pounds of fentanyl. I mean, 100 micrograms will kill you dead. That were smuggled into the United States from Mexico alone. But it generates so much money that there's almost a political class of people within this regulatory world, or that do not particularly want that flow of money cut off once it's clean, and that's where we're going to have difficulty.
But you also, as well, and I know this is maybe kind of like a segue into like a slightly different discussion, and maybe not one for today. But one of the challenges we've also seen more recently as well is coming into the Trump administration is a step away from ESG commitments by all of the major banks in the US as well. And again, this is something that we're quite conscious of under the Trump administration, moving back, moving away from renewable energy to oil, to gas, to coal. And we've seen the likes of Goldman's, Wells Fargo, Bank of America, Citigroup, Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, all step back from the Net Zero Banking Alliance, which was to support environmental initiatives and make sure that their loans and their activities within that sector aligned to environmental practices. So, there is a hell of a lot of, I wouldn't even say rejigging, changes in ideologies happening underneath the Trump administration. And this is happening across the board. We're going to see a complete, in my opinion, rewrite of sanction regimes as well. Like if you look recently at the list of countries that have been added to the change your, passport security policies or you'll be blacklisted by us, that was issued a few weeks ago, we saw the likes of, for example, St. Kitts on that, because people are able to buy passports in inverted commas, which is correct. But golden passports aren't exclusive to, you know, tax havens or countries such as that. You know, we see it in Europe in the likes of Belgium, you know, Portugal, you know, in the US as well, you can get a golden passport. So my question is, are we, you know, are we specifically choosing which countries we want to target and kind of leaving out the obvious? You know, I remember when I was in private banking, I had a number of clients, Belgian clients coming through, and they weren't Belgian, they were from Kazakhstan, but they've been able to purchase passports, you know, within Belgium. So we're facing a number of challenges from different directions within the practitioner perspective at the moment, where, you know, sanction regimes are changing, um, security regimes are changing, ESG commitments are changing. I'm actually starting to question, what does this mean globally for policies and for organizations in their fight against illicit activity or activity that's not aligned to what the general public see as benefiting the greater good of society. I know that's a very, very far-reaching statement, but there's so many changes happening at the moment.
Very true. Una, I mean, it strikes me that, you know, almost from the moment he had his second inauguration on January 20th, that Trump has gone after financial regulation. And you saw this in his first term as well, that he went after regulatory agencies that sought to curb corporate power. I mean, with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, FCPA, you know, gutting Dodd-Frank. You're right. I mean, it is a sea shift in policy in terms of those that sought to contain the power of the corporate sector and banking and financial institutions. That was an overriding concern for at least some segments of the Biden administration. Again, these levers, these rules are very powerful. The mere threat to use U.S. law was enough to ensure compliance. So I bring that up to say, because it's a powerful tool, because the U.S. has the means to enforce its will extraterritorially, is it inconceivable that we might see selective enforcement?
Well, of course we will. But you could also, I think one of the things we need to talk about here, which is kind of the elephant in the room, is the UBO transparency as well. This is just obviously under the Biden administration, we saw a shift towards greater transparency on UBOs. And then if you look at 2019 in Hong Kong, we saw a shift away from that under the securities laws. Then subsequently in Europe in 2020, we also saw a shift away from transparency in UBO identification. So now obviously the Trump administration is moving away from that transparency as well. So this isn't a Pacific, you know, well, you could argue, is a Pacific Trump administration move because it's differing from the Biden administration? 100% yes. But from a global perspective, we're seeing similar movements in terms of data privacy and security issues, in terms of what information does the public need at large. And remember, that's the important point here. We will still be able to get access to UBO information. Rather, it is, should this information be, you know, accessible to the public at large. So there's big changes, but they're not US specific. And when I mentioned ESG before, you know, we've also seen similar moves with UBS, with Macquarie as well, and also with HSBC. So there is a global shift at the moment, because a lot of these initiatives, if we look at AMLA, for example, the European Anti-Money Laundering Authority, what we see in Europe is that financial regulation isn't having the positive effect that we had anticipated or hoped it would give. The problem is we're using outdated technology. I would say even outdated technology. We're not using technology that's fit for purpose. We're not implementing risk-based controls. We're basically implementing controls that are ticking regulatory boxes. So, you know, you could argue that regulation in itself isn't working. If you look at the sanction regimes, approximately 60% of frozen assets are not specific to sanctioned individuals. but rather a risk appetite of organizations who are slightly risk adverse in this area. And that's causing a massive impact on individuals trying to do business day to day. If you look at London, for example, at the moment, we have mass areas of London where there are, very in central London, where we've very expensive houses that are basically sitting there. And these houses are so old that they need constant, investment in terms of upkeep. But because of the sanction regimes, these houses that are owned by Russian individuals or people with nexus to Russian connections, they can't use them because they're frozen and they can't access their funds to make the repairs. So this is actually also having an impact on society at large. I think there's really an opportunity right now, and this is why I'm kind of from one perspective aligned to agree with the fact that we need to stop for a second and think. I don't think we've been thinking strategically or logically about how we're actually enforcing these requirements and looking at where they will actually have the maximum impact. Rather, we've been creating and adding regulation on top of regulation, and the resulting output is not what we had hoped for. And I don't know, Malcolm, if you would have a different view on that, but I think we've overregulated within an inch of our life, and we've kind of we can't see the wood for the trees. And taking a minute to pause and reflect and look at guidelines and look at policy and understand how it's working in practice isn't maybe such a bad thing for a temporary period of time, and then look at ways in which we can more effectively enforce it, if, however, that's the longer term intention.
I think you're right. And the system was regulated to the nth degree, and there was a reason for that, because after 9/11, we found that there were multi-billions of dollars flowing around illicitly through the world that were financing terrorism, that were funding regimes which were antithetical to the world order, and the United States led the way in cracking down on that on a very, very, very broad scale. The George W. Bush administration early on was very amenable to raising a lot of these regulations. And then after 9/11, it was a door that slammed in the global face, because we really needed to get a handle on, was honey manufacturing in Yemen flowing into Saudi Arabia and Dubai being cleaned up, and then shipped, dropped off in suitcases in front of terrorists in the Arabian Peninsula or other Southwest Asia.
The notorious honey laundering case.
It was real. Osama bin Laden's honey businesses in Yemen, and Yemen is famous for this, right? For the honey. The question is, where's the money? Who is the ultimate beneficiary, right? When that money gets to Dubai, or that money gets to Doha, that's where that door really came down hard. I think a lot of people, as we are moving into this new world, and I'm going to correct you all on one thing. What is happening here in my country, the United States, is not a sea change. You are seeing a tectonic shift in the poles of the world, because the Trump administration is operating under the belief, which is also encouraged by Elon Musk, the world's richest man, that the world should be multipolar. It shouldn't be an alliance of democracies. It should be where Russia has that Eurasianism belief of Russia being the dominant force in Europe. Europe has quite a bit to say about that. They're not going along willingly. And that the United States would have dominance in North America and in the Western Hemisphere, and that China should have a free hand. There are people in the United States government who are actually taking chainsaws to the government that believe this. And in doing that, they also believe that inhibiting anybody's money right now, whether it's through sanctions, whether it's through drug and money laundering, certainly things that are coming through crypto, they really believe that this should be the Wild West, and they should be completely hands off, and that the free market should also be the free money. And of course, that has social impacts. As you said, ESG, right? These are dirty, dirty, dirty words in Washington right now. Don't ever mention those with regards to how they think that the banking should be operated, and they are taking not just a chainsaw but a sledgehammer to that system. And I think what you're seeing is you are seeing not just the nose of the camel under the tent. You're seeing the camel run over the tent, and I think it's only going to get worse.
I think one thing's important, Malcolm, from an in-house financial institution perspective, we always blur together money laundering and terrorist financing as kind of, areas under financial crime. And the two of them are polar opposites from one another. Identifying, if you ever go into a bank and you do a training on money laundering, I guarantee you'll get one slide on terrorist financing thrown in because one, many people don't understand it, but two, the challenge here is a lot of money in terrorist financing has legitimate sources. It doesn't come from illegitimate business activities or indeed individuals. It comes from belief systems, especially if we're talking specific here to the donation side, not obviously to, corporate entities that have been sent up to orchestrate movements of monies for terrorist organizations. And identifying those flow of funds is at times virtually impossible because you're having to go back to the core, understanding the core belief systems of individuals who have on the surface legitimately obtained funds. Because obviously a lot of this is done through as well fiat, just cash donations. And if we look at the crypto space, only around 2% of monies that flow into terrorist financing comes through the crypto regime because of our ability to detect flows within blockchain analytics. Our biggest challenge here is NGOs, and that's something actually that has been raised by the Trump administration about funding two charitable initiatives that's just disappeared and it's been unaccountable. And I, for one, really agree with this as an area that we need to focus. I'm not pro any political move, but I'm Northern Irish. I don't have a political point or political viewpoint on any regime or any political party. But I do agree with the fact that there is a lot of funding that goes to NGOs, for example, and we're talking billions of dollars a year that goes unaccounted for. So the question is, is it right for us to be looking at this 100%? Do we understand typologies within terrorist financing, within financial institutions to identify it? No, we don't. And are we able to identify it? Unless there's a blaringly obvious sanction violation or a nexus to a sanctioned individual that's identified or legal person's identified, or indeed if there's an investigation, the quick answer is no. Like it's virtually impossible to identify. So the question goes back to, we have all of these controls in place in organizations. It's costing banks, let's take Singapore alone. They spent $3.5 billion US within the financial industry on compliance last year alone. Where is that money going? And are we actually seeing the longer term benefits from it? Or is the information that we're getting beneficial? And my argument here is, like, take a good example. When you onboard a customer into a bank, you have approximately 1,400 data points in that customer. Day to day, we use approximately 100 to 120 data points. The rest of that information is left on a piece of paper. We have no way of profiling customers, but we expect rules and scenario systems to be able to help us identify complex networks or illicit activity or involvement in corruption or any other type of financial crime. It's absolutely, from a logical perspective, it's insanity. But we still continue to do it. So I myself want to see a massive overhaul within regulation. And I'm excited, for example, in particular with Europe, to see AMLA starting to focus on, is regulation working? Have we over-engineered it? Are we really properly employing new technology? I don't want to say AI, but, large language models, LLMs, etc. Are we using these to our advantage to identify real illicit activity? Or are we just ticking boxes and throwing money against a wall and hoping that it sticks somewhere? For me, the truth at the moment is we're doing the latter. And it really scares me as an industry because we're not risk-based. And these, policy and procedures, they're all great. But so the question earlier, are we using these regimes and these enforcement actions to target specific individuals? That I think the answer there is yes, to an extent. Extent, the FCPA is being used to target specific individuals or corporations where we have a feeling, or we know that corruption is involved. But corruption is happening as a way of business across the world, in many countries, and getting away from being involved in that, bribery, etc. It is part of how people do business. So how do we manage, and how do we, I know I just mentioned a lot of different things there, but how do we manage doing business and not, allowing bribes, but yet knowing that without those bribes, which is the way of doing business in that country, we won't be able to further our business opportunities within either that sector or indeed that country. Where is the happy ground here?
Malcolm, I wanted to say to you, I mean, to your point about the system being regulated to the nth degree, I mean, that's so true. The late Senator Carl Levin of Florida was on the floor of the Senate pre-9/11 arguing how badly more needed to be done on the AML, KYC, CTF front. Yet before 9/11, it wasn't seen as a priority. It wasn't seen as imperative. And then after 9/11, the pendulum swung too far the other way, and you end up with the Patriot Act. I mean, maybe that's indicative of how reactionary the system is. But I guess if you were a compliance officer, in-house lawyer at a multinational corporation or bank or any kind of financial institution outside the U.S., and you hear this, you see what the Trump administration's doing, what should your approach be? How are you to make sense of this, and what are you to implement on a practical level?
Well, I certainly wouldn't be a lawyer. It would be one of the more difficult jobs in the world. To be quite honest, I would be hot on my phone to Una and calling her in for a consultation. She's a real expert on this.
Yeah. Well, no, so Malcolm, I'm in awe of you. You have the exciting job, but thank you for saying that my job sounds interesting.
It certainly is interesting because the sexy work is not sexy at all. It is all paperwork. It does involve travel claims sometimes, but as going back to the original question, if I were having to make a recommendation to a general counsel, it would be that you should understand that although it may seem a lot more fun, interesting, and exciting to certainly delve into the world as it's being re-engineered right now, you still have obligations to shareholders. You still have obligations to regulations within countries that are not going the wild, wild west with regards to money laundering and things like that. Una made a very interesting point I want to touch on, where she said some of the places that are being harmed are NGOs and gray area organizations around the world that need to flow money, that must live within the culture. And there are cultures out there. I've been to Lahore. I've been to a couple of other special places where, palms need to be greased at the small scale. I used the Hawala banking system early on when I was a senior security officer in Iraq for a major NGO under the United Nations. And I had to transfer $1 million, and it originated somewhere and it landed on my desk in cash. How it happened, I don't know. But that is one of the things the United States was going after greatly after 9/11, that now we have to recognize that there are places where there needs to be softenings so that money can flow that is not illicit. However, we also need to be very aware that in the current Trump administration, they are not talking about getting, greasing palms to get bandages delivered in a bongo truck to a small village 300 kilometers in the middle of the desert. They're not. They're talking about very, very high level, oligarch level kleptocracy money, and that many people are trying to get some of that, get more of that.
Yeah.
You are going to have to really work within the network of where your money is going to end up. If it's London, you're going to have to believe in AML. If it's New York, they may be part of the Wild West, but they are also going to have to be very, very responsive to the people who actually own that system and to keep themselves out of liability.
Yeah. Well, you raised an interesting point there as well about Hawala. With Hawala, it's one of the oldest, banking systems in the world, the banking networks. And one very, very interesting observation, one of our biggest risks, not to go down a rabbit hole, one of our biggest risks in banking is exposure to illicit money movements through trade finance. And an interesting fact is that approximately 92% of funding for trade is done through open source funding. What does that mean? Or open banking is actually done outside of the regulated financial network. So, only 8% of funding is actually regulated. And then obviously we implement all of these regulations to try and identify illicit activity within trade finance, which, by the way, is an absolute minefield because it's largely paper-based with letters of credit. The screening requirements are overly laborious. But this is only impacting 8% of funding within or financing within the trade finance space. So is it effective? In terms of identifying illicit activity? If you look at the bigger picture, absolutely not. But we're implementing it, and it's a very, very old system as well. But Hawala, traditionally, yes, you're absolutely right. It can be used to move illicit funds, but it's also relied on in many cultures for the transfer of monies by the unbanked. And we've tried to move towards the removal of people being financially excluded. But what has happened as a result of this, and I actually had the privilege of being invited to the UN last year to speak on this, was we are giving vulnerable women access to the financial system, which is amazing in that they're the previously unbanked women in various sectors of cultures and societies that previously wouldn't have had access now have their own bank accounts. But it's like giving a child a gun and expecting them to know when the safety's on. They're not taught how to use these bank accounts. They're not taught about the risks of financial crime, and by default they then become conduits for financial crime, i.e. for money laundering or money mule activities, because other people around them are using them and using their banking platforms for those activities. So we have the challenge we have at the moment, we're trying to fight thousands of fires. And we really need to think and take a step back and think, well, look, where do we need to fight the fires to protect the public at large? Where is the education that we need in respect of the public? But also, where are we shooting ourselves in the foot because we've implemented overly laborious controls or guidelines which are impacting our ability to be competitive and impacting our competitive advantage? And I'm not saying that as I said earlier, I'm not saying that I'm all for the removal of the FCPA. That's not at all what I'm saying. Rather, I am saying is, we are competitively disadvantaging the US in certain respects from entering into business activities in countries where bribery is actually the modus operandi of doing business. So what do we do there? Do we just say, and I've said this earlier, from a carte blanche perspective, we won't do business there? Or do we look at this more practically and say, well, look, we know this is an accepted way of doing business. So there's a lot of challenges at the moment which need to be addressed across the board. And I said this comment earlier, we can't see the wood for the trees at the moment because we're trying to fight so many different issues. Even when we've been on this podcast, I got sent over an article about the US lifting sanctions on Tornado Cash, which is a mixer, a crypto mixer, which was linked to North Korean money laundering. And in the statement, the Treasury said, we exercised our discretion to delist Tornado Cash following the legal battle. But obviously these mixers are, when you use multiple mixers, you can corrupt or break the blockchain or the chain. So what does that mean? It means that our blockchain analytic capabilities are no longer useful because we can't actually see where the money goes, where the crypto moves to. So this is a big move that we're actually removing sanction restrictions from large crypto mixers, which we know have been involved in activities involving countries such as North Korea. So, I know that we started this conversation on FCPA and we've moved through a number of different areas, but these are game changers and they open us up to massive exposures and challenges across the board. So I think we're going to be riding by the kind of the pants on our seat at the moment, so to speak, because I just don't know where this is going to take us in terms of, if I look at it from a banking perspective, how we're supposed to protect ourselves when we're then now permitted to onboard these institutions, where we're allowed to receive monies from countries that potentially do have embargoes against them. Where does this leave organizations in their protection from enforcement action?
I think Una has struck a key note here, which goes to the previous question. What should you do? How would you advise? Limiting exposure, I think, is the best advice that anyone can give by playing it, and we've said this before, play it as cleanly and as transparently as you can.
In the time we've got left, any closing thoughts, any last impressions you'd like to leave our listeners with?
I really think with the Trump administration, we are seeing a global tectonic shift in where they think they're going to get money, where they want to get money, and whether they get money and whether they care how that money was acquired, and who the ultimate beneficiary should be, Donald Trump and his administration. And that is going to change things dramatically. I don't look forward to being, someone tossed out into the middle of the Pacific Ocean in the middle of a typhoon in a small boat. But that's where a lot of regulators are going to be over the next few years.
Una.
I want to see a move towards deregulation. I want to see a move towards more principles-based regulation, where we are expecting financial institutions to understand their inherent risks and mitigate their inherent risks, that they fully understand evolving financial crime threats and trends, and that they're implementing the right technology. And I think that if anything, we should be calling out the need for specific technology and investment in technology in our field. So that's really where I want to see the move towards. Do I think, going back to the initial question, that this initial 180-day pause on enforcement action on the FCPA is a good move? Yes, I think any move where we take a breather and look at the practical effect and, implement, how guidelines have been implemented and whether they're working when they're not working is a good thing to do. 100%, it's a great thing to do. So I welcome this. What I don't welcome is completely removing our integrity and removing the fact that we want to do business in the right way. And I'm very much integrity based. When we're, any country is out there operating and doing business, it should be done in a way that benefits, in my opinion, the greater good. Again, that's not how organizations operate, but, we should be looking at the societal benefits. And so that's something, and maybe that's a very utopian viewpoint, but it all comes back to integrity. So where, certain individuals are benefiting from bribes, whether in, government entities or indeed certain industries, that's not something I want to see happen. I want to see, if any monies are used, those monies are being funneled back in to projects which are benefiting a societal initiative. That's of course not going to happen. But yes, the bottom line is regulation isn't working. I think it was right to pause the FCPA enforcement to really look on cause versus effect versus practicalities. But I want to see that more mainstream across all financial regulation, because I think we could all agree that it's not working. It's not working with the intended purpose it's having. And banks are getting caught up with enforcement action, which in my opinion is, they're trying to look for a needle in a haystack.
Well, I guess we'll leave it there, and certainly a discussion I'm sure we'll revisit at some point. Una van den Berg, Malcolm Nance, thank you for your time.
Our pleasure.
Pleasure. AJ, thank you.
Not at all. And to our listeners, thank you all. Until next time.